Hello and welcome to Sense and Sensibility, the Inflation Guy podcast. I am Michael Ashton. I am the Inflation Guy and I am your host. And today on the podcast, we're going to do this a little bit differently. But first, we're going to get to our sponsors. That remains the same. This episode of Sense and Sensibility is sponsored by Simplify ETFs, a fast-growing manager of liquid alternative ETFs. Simplify is bringing Wall Street to Main Street by providing access to institutional strategies perfect for diversifying your equity and bond portfolios previously only available to big institutions and the ultra-rich. Check out their website at simplify.us. That's simplify.us. And you can find their entire lineup of ETFs at simplify.us/ETFs. Okay, so as I said, this is going to be a different podcast. And the main way it's going to be different is that typically when I produce a podcast, it's more or less scripted. I don't necessarily read word for word what I've written down, but by writing it down, especially since I'm a writer and I do lots and lots of writing, I can develop the themes in a way that is very systematic. And even though when I sort of read it, I'll make it conversational, so it doesn't sound like I'm just reading a piece of paper. Hopefully, still it's going to be structured. It's going to be hopefully, in most cases, the least amount of time used to develop that theme. And by writing it down, I make sure that I don't forget important points to bring up and stuff like that. And those points are in more or less the right place. And it doesn't always work out exactly that way, especially the CPI report itself. A lot of that is sort of freewheeling a little bit, but I still have sort of a structure in that case because I've just written my monthly CPI report. So I've just written something and then I go talk about it. So that's pretty easy. Today, we're not going to do that. And that's because we have sort of a big event happening tomorrow, and that's the imposition of reciprocal tariffs on other countries by the U.S. And this is a big economic event. And I just haven't had time to write anything. And there are a couple of they're major points, but there are a couple of points that I want to make that maybe it doesn't need to be a 30-minute episode, but there's some important points that I think are worth considering. And they're sort of along the general theme that tariffs, not only are tariffs not as bad as you've been led to believe, the effect when all these tariffs go into effect at the same time is not going to be apocalyptic like you've been led to believe. It's a limited number of points that I want to make, and I'm just going to talk about them. And if this episode is really bad and it doesn't sound any good, then you'll never hear it because I won't publish it. And so I'm just recording it, and we'll just sort of see how this goes. So when you hear about tariffs, and we've heard about tariffs and tariffs and tariffs and tariffs. We've heard about nothing but for a couple of months now. And of course, the first thing you hear is that tariffs are bad. And they're bad, I guess, especially when the U.S. does them, because every other country in the world has tariffs, and almost all of them have higher tariffs than the United States. But for some reason, when the U.S. wants to institute tariffs, it's really bad. And this all goes back to sort of the Ricardian idea, and I've talked about this before, and I won't elaborate it very much here. The Ricardian idea that in a world with certain unrealistic characteristics, the best possible trading system amongst these economic actors is for everybody to produce according to their comparative advantage and trade freely. And whether those are countries or individuals, right? So you as an individual, you happen to be very good at making shoes, and so it makes more sense for you to focus on making shoes and trade it for food, trade it for automobiles, trade it for whatever. Okay, it's just a way of trading your labor. Now, what would happen if you made your shoes and the person who was selling you food decided that they were going to charge you extra. Well, that kind of happens, right? But if that, that there's a profit, but even if kind of abstracting from that, if somebody who's manufacturing food and wants to trade for your shoes decides to charge you way too much for the food, then you just make the food yourself, right? So if you kind of think about this as sort of individuals, I think you get to sort of this more rational idea. There may also be, even if you can get food at the grocery store, and you can think about COVID, even if you can get food at the grocery store, it may make sense for you to keep some food in your cupboard, a bunch of cans of soup, or maybe you're growing a crop in your backyard, because as immunization against the possibility that the grocery store might not be able to deliver you food or might charge you too much. And so there's a sort of a security reason there to sort of hold back and not engage in just free trade where all I do is make shoes and I trade them for everything. Okay, so there are, in the real world, where there aren't frictionless markets, different people, different economic actors behave in ways that look maybe not necessarily rational in some sense, but are rational unto themselves, and have concerns that are outside of price and quantity. The optimal answer isn't necessarily that everybody trades with everybody else in a free, frictionless manner. So that's sort of a general point that I've made this general point quite a bit, that the Ricardian ideal just isn't the way the real world works. But I want to make sort of a more poignant point, or I think it's poignant. You'll have to tell me if you think it's poignant. But I want to make a more poignant point about the specific calamity that's about to happen, about to hit our shores when the Trump administration raises dramatically, in many cases, the tariffs imposed on imported goods. And you've read a lot about how this is going to be, borderline apocalypse, right? So there's going to be massive unemployment, massive increases in prices. You're going to have stagflation like crazy. And there's going to be some effects. No question there's going to be some effects. Some of them aren't in the direction that you think. Employment's likely to go up, not down, for example. But the calamity is unlikely to happen. And one of the reasons why is that if you're a domestic manufacturer, everything that you're hearing right now as a consumer is the worst possible case. Okay, so it's Ford Motor Company. Ford Motor Company buys a whole lot of auto parts from Canada. Those auto parts are suddenly going to be crazy expensive because of tariffs, and so Ford Motor Company is going to have to pay a lot more for those auto parts. Therefore, the price of their cars is going to go up a ton, or at least the cost of their cars. And so Ford can either have much lower profits or much higher car prices, probably lower sales because of those higher prices. And so it's kind of really bad for everybody. Okay, that's the worst possible case. So guess what the executives at Ford Motor Company, guess what their number one job is? Okay, the number one job is to not let the worst possible thing happen. Okay, it's like literally, if you are put in charge of a company, your job one is don't let the worst possible thing happen. Whatever that worst possible thing is, don't let it happen. And so it turns out that manufacturers, all large manufacturers, most medium-sized manufacturers, and many small manufacturers recognize that there's no, especially in a world that has gone increasingly to just-in-time manufacturing, where having a very stable supply chain, the parts showing up at exactly the right time is really important, and especially after the experience of COVID, when supply chains suddenly got shattered. Okay, what manufacturers understand is that you can't have one supplier of anything. unless it happens to be something which subject to a patent, and you have to have this particular part from this particular manufacturer. That's fairly unusual. For big manufacturers, most smaller manufacturers, it is routine, not to say de rigueur, to have at least one secondary qualified supplier for any given part, and likely an emergency domestic supplier of the part. Okay, and so the way this works is you, as Ford Motor Company, have decided to get this particular product, this particular part from this one manufacturer that's in Canada. Okay. But you never know if that manufacturer is going to be hit by a meteor. And so you make sure you have a second qualified supplier. Now, what I mean by qualified supplier is, you can't just go, if you're a Ford Motor Company, you just can't go to Home Depot and start taking, screws off the rack. You have to have, all the parts you buy have a very specific tolerance, and you have to know that your supplier can produce to the tolerance that you need, the cleanliness that you need, the color that you need, and so on. And so that process for each and every part that goes into a car or any other manufactured item is fairly elaborate to establish that this supplier produces to the standard that we demand, and we have another supplier, and maybe we buy some of our products from the supplier just to keep them, producing, but we have at least one other supplier who, in a pinch, can provide us with these things. Okay. And again, this is not something that you do overnight. This is something that generally involves a lot of testing to make sure you have different qualified suppliers. After COVID, anybody who didn't have a domestic qualified supplier, certainly many manufacturers moved from having multiple qualified suppliers overseas to ones that were in theater, so in Mexico and Canada. But many of these manufacturers also have at least an emergency domestic nearby qualified supplier of various products. Again, not all the products, but not all the parts. But what we're trying to establish is that the worst possible case is not likely to be the actual case. If you are Ford and you notice that the crank axle, I don't think that's a real part, but anyway, the crank axle bolt that's made in Canada is suddenly 3 times more expensive. You just look in your book and you see that the alternative supplier is located in Flint, Michigan, and you go and you call them up. And you say, I'm going to need 3 million crank axle bolts, and that's where you run into sort of a secondary problem, which is if all the big three, or the big however many auto manufacturers all need to go from that to that one supplier of crank axle bolts, and there's no one else, then they're not going to be able to buy them all from the domestic manufacturer. In that case, they'll still buy some of the crank axle bolts from Canada and some of them from the supplier in Flint, Michigan. But let's review. The worst possible case didn't happen. You're only buying 50% of those expensive crank axle bolts, and you're buying 50% of the ones domestically. Furthermore, the supplier in Flint, Michigan is going to hire. That's where the additional employment in the U.S. comes from. They're going to have to hire and expand. And as they do, then Ford Motor Company is going to buy fewer and fewer crank axle bolts from Canada and more from the supplier in Flint, Michigan. And so, again, the whole notion of capitalism is that, and by the way, the whole mission of management at major companies is to make the system resilient to impacts and to things that can go wrong, and to spend a lot of time thinking about, what could go wrong? In the lead up to COVID, I was working with a company that got a lot of their supplies from India, from a supplier that was many days by boat away. And we started asking the question before any of the shutdowns happened. We said, what happens if we do shut everybody down? Then what happens if we can't get anything out of India? And so the first thing we did when we thought about that is we bought a ridiculous amount of stuff from India, put it on a boat, and had it shipped over as fast as we could. We wanted to get everything on the water as fast as we could, just in case there was a shutdown. And sure enough, there was. But it wasn't as impactful because we had thought ahead. We had some inventory. And by the way, inventory is one of the ways that you manage through this. And by the way, we've seen in the fourth quarter and in the first quarter, you saw a massive increase in imports. A lot of that is manufacturers' inventories blunting the effect of when these tariffs go into effect. That huge increase in imports in that first quarter is going to turn into negative growth in the first quarter or maybe even the second quarter. And so it'll look like a recession. But in the meantime, while we have these, this big trade number that's causing us to be in a recession, you're going to actually see domestic hiring at the crank axle bolt manufacturer in Flint, Michigan, and lots of other places. So what happens to prices in that case? Well, obviously prices still go up. They go up because you're not getting all of your crank axle bolts from the domestic supplier. They go up because the domestic supplier can raise his prices because now, his competition is the guy in Canada who's 3 times more expensive than he is, and so he can raise his prices, a fair amount before you want to go back to your original supplier, and so there's that effect. And to you, the consumer, once Ford realizes the cost of their car is higher than it was, they decide how much of a hit can they take to earnings and how much of a hit will it cause them in sales if they raise the price 10%, 20%, 5%, whatever. And they make a decision to how much of the cost to pass on to the domestic consumer. That number, that how much to pass along, is less than 100%. And how much less depends on how much, what the elasticity for demand and the elasticity of supply is in that particular market. And that's way beyond my commentary here. But the point is that it's not 100%. And the other point is that it's a one-time shift. So I've just mentioned that, when this goes into effect, you can only get 50% of your crank axle bolts from the guy in Flint, Michigan. But over time, as the U.S. manufactures more and more, becomes more and more self-sufficient, and by the way, the U.S. already has, is much more self-sufficient in almost everything than just about any other country out there. As we get a domestic manufacturer for anything, then that impact might actually lessen. So you might get not, what I've been believing is that you'd get this one-time jump from tariffs, and then you wouldn't have a continued followed through to higher inflation. It might be even better than that, because it may be that you get the jump, and then as the economic system adapts and produces more domestically, and so we have to buy fewer of the expensive manufacturers parts from overseas, that the domestic costs actually decline. I don't know, hard to tell. But what you can count on is that the businesses want to produce the lowest cost goods they can, and they want to pass on as much of that cost as they can, but no more. And they don't get to decide by themselves how much of the cost they want to pass on, because you're a consumer and you get to decide whether or not you're going to buy the product or not. Again, it comes down to the elasticity of supply and demand, whether you can live without that product and so on, but it most assuredly is not 100%. Anyway, so my main point, to sum up, is that companies, manufacturing companies, businesses in general, are designed to be resilient. They're designed and they're managed in such a way that when bad things happen, they already have another plan. They've got some alternatives so that they can avoid the worst possible outcome. And especially when you have something like this where the policy has been telegraphed well in advance, And you saw this in the imports. You saw this in more domestic hiring for manufacturers and stuff like that. You already started to see companies begin to adapt. And that is a feature that makes the whole thing, the whole reciprocal tariffs nightmare, is not going to be as nightmarish as you think. Now, it's going to be nightmarish for the rest of the world if countries don't lower their tariffs, but it's not going to be nightmarish here in the U.S., or certainly not as nightmarish as you read. And I suspect that what happens as time goes on and other countries discover that their major consumer, their major customer is learning to live without them, my guess is that you'll see tariffs around the world towards the U.S. go down, reciprocal tariffs go down. And so, again, you may well get a positive impact from tariffs on price, and then gradually you actually get a decline in those tariffs that dampens price inflation going forward. Exactly how this plays out will determine what that looks like, and I will guide you through all of it as it comes along. And that is all for today's episode, the freewheeling Mike Ashton Inflation Guy episode. That's all for today's podcast. Please like, subscribe, refer others. This part, see, I'm still reading. You can contact me at inflationguy@enduringinvestments.com, and the blog is at inflationguy.blog. That's where you should go and be paying attention in the next week or two, because I am going to have a big announcement about a cryptocurrency project that we are working on. That's going to be something that's never been done. Actually, even in TradFi markets, you're going to want to be paying attention to that. That's inflationguy.blog. Follow me on X at inflation_guy. And visit Enduring Investments if you need help with diagnosing or treating an inflation problem, or if you're a manufacturer who needs to talk about some of this stuff. But most importantly, defend your money. And if inflation is coming for you, remember, you know a guy.